Blood soaked into Virginia soil like communion wine into bread, while 21 white bodies lay scattered across Southampton County farms on a humid August morning. The iron taste of revolution hung thick in the summer air, mingling with the sweet scent of ripening tobacco and the acrid smoke rising from burning barns. This is the story of how one enslaved preacher transformed biblical prophecy into the deadliest slave rebellion in American history, leaving a trail of terror that would reshape an entire nation's relationship with bondage. Nathaniel Turner stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with skin the color of burnished copper and eyes that burned with the intensity of someone who believed God spoke directly through him. Born into slavery on October 2, 1800, in Southampton County, Virginia, he possessed 2 things that made plantation owners nervous: literacy and religious fervor. His master, Benjamin Turner, had allowed young Nat's education, a decision that would echo through history in ways no one could foresee. The Turner plantation sprawled across rolling hills where morning mist clung to tobacco rows like ghostly fingers. Here, the sound of axes splitting wood mixed with the rhythmic thud of cotton gins, while the smell of curing leaves drifted from weathered barns. Nat moved through this world with the careful steps of someone who saw signs in everything: the flight patterns of birds, the color of sunsets, the shapes clouds formed against Virginia's endless sky. By 1828, Turner had experienced what he described as divine revelations. He'd seen black and white spirits fighting in the heavens, heard voices commanding him to prepare for a great work. These visions came with startling clarity during his prayer sessions in the woods, where he'd carved crude symbols into oak trees and practiced sermons that would never grace a proper pulpit. From Turner's own confession, recorded August 31st, 1831, "I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to me and said the serpent was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men." The rebellion began forming in Turner's mind like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. He'd identified a core group of trusted followers: Henry Porter, a fellow preacher; Hark Travis, whose master had recently died; Nelson Williams, known for his fierce temperament; and Sam Francis, whose quiet demeanor masked revolutionary fire. These men met in secret, sharing Turner's belief that divine providence would guide their mission. What Turner understood, perhaps better than any enslaved person before him, was the power of religious authority combined with careful planning. He'd spent years building his reputation as a prophet, healing the sick with herbal remedies, predicting weather patterns, and interpreting dreams with uncanny accuracy. White neighbors sought his counsel, unaware they were consulting with someone who viewed their destruction as God's will. The conspiracy took shape during hushed conversations in slave quarters and clandestine gatherings in the woods. Turner selected August 21st, 1831, as the date, believing a solar eclipse that February had been heaven's signal to begin preparations. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Start at the Travis farm where Turner lived, kill every white person they encountered, gather weapons and recruits, then march on Jerusalem, the county seat, sparking a region-wide uprising. But Turner's vision extended beyond mere revenge. He believed this rebellion would fulfill biblical prophecy, that enslaved people across the South would rise simultaneously, creating a new order where the last would be first. His followers shared this messianic certainty, viewing themselves not as murderers, but as instruments of divine justice. The final meeting occurred on August 20th, in a secluded cabin where 6 conspirators shared roasted pig and apple brandy. They discussed their route, identified initial targets, and made final preparations. Turner carried a small hatchet he'd sharpened until it could split hairs, while his followers assembled clubs, knives, and whatever crude weapons they could gather without arousing suspicion. As midnight approached on August 21st, Turner knelt in prayer one final time. The woods around him pulsed with cicada songs and the distant hoot of owls while humidity pressed against his skin like a shroud. He'd told his followers that heaven itself would open to receive the souls of the righteous, while their oppressors would face eternal damnation. None of them could imagine how quickly divine mission would transform into human nightmare, or how the blood they were about to spill would forever change the conversation about slavery in America. Before we go deeper into this dark chapter of American history, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records for nearly 2 centuries. The question that haunted Southampton County that night wasn't whether Turner would act on his divine calling, but whether anyone would survive the reckoning he believed God had ordained. The hatchet fell at 2 a.m. with the whispered thud of splitting watermelon. Joseph Travis never woke from the blow that caved in his skull, his blood pooling on pine floorboards still warm from the day's heat. The smell of sweat and fear mingled with the metallic tang that would follow Turner's band for the next 48 hours. This was the moment when religious prophecy transformed into irreversible violence, setting in motion events that would terrify the entire South. Turner's hand trembled as he delivered the fatal strike to his master's sleeping form. The man who had inherited him along with the plantation lay motionless, his wife Sally beginning to stir beside him. What happened next revealed the methodical nature of Turner's plan. Henry Porter and Sam Francis moved through the house like shadows, dispatching the remaining family members with axes and knives. 10-year-old Putnam Moore, Sally's son from a previous marriage, tried to hide under a bed, but was dragged out and killed with the same brutal efficiency. The Travis farmhouse fell silent, except for the grandfather clock that continued ticking in the parlor, marking time that no longer mattered to its owners. Turner's followers ransacked the house for weapons, finding several muskets, powder, and shot. More importantly, they discovered horses in the stable, transforming their walking rebellion into a mounted force. From the Southampton County Court records, September 5th, 1831. The bodies were discovered in various states of mutilation, suggesting the use of blunt instruments rather than firearms in the initial assault. Turner paused outside the farmhouse, studying his bloodied hatchet in the moonlight. This was his Rubicon moment, the point of no return that would either fulfill divine prophecy or damn him as a common murderer. His followers watched him with a mixture of awe and terror, understanding they had crossed a line that existed in more than just law. The rebellion's success depended on speed and momentum. Turner's strategy required striking multiple farms before dawn, preventing any warning from reaching Jerusalem or neighboring plantations. They mounted the Travis horses and rode toward the Francis farm, where Sam Francis's intimate knowledge of the property would prove invaluable. But Turner's band had grown to 8 men by the time they left Travis farm, picking up recruits who had witnessed the carnage and chose revolution over the certainty of brutal punishment for mere association. Each new member brought local knowledge: which families owned the most weapons, which overseers were cruelest, which routes would avoid the main roads where patrols might be forming. At the Francis farm, the killing continued with disturbing efficiency. Nathaniel Francis and his wife were dispatched in their beds, while their children were hunted through the house like rabbits. Turner himself killed infant Whitehead Francis with his hatchet, an act that would haunt prosecution testimonies and newspaper accounts for decades. The band's numbers swelled to 15 as more enslaved people joined what they believed was the beginning of a general uprising. Divine mission became human slaughter. The pattern established at the Travis and Francis farms would repeat throughout the night. Overwhelming force applied to sleeping families, systematic collection of weapons and horses, recruitment of anyone willing to risk their life for freedom. But what Turner's followers didn't realize was how their actions were being observed by people who chose neither to help nor hinder. At the Reese farm, an elderly enslaved woman named Charity watched from her cabin window as Turner's band approached the main house. She could have raised an alarm, could have warned her masters of the approaching danger, Instead, she pulled her shutters closed and waited for the screams to end. When questioned later, she claimed to have slept through the entire massacre. What would you have done, watching your oppressors face the violence they had normalized for generations? Turner divided his growing army into smaller groups to cover more ground as dawn approached. His lieutenant, Hark Travis, led one party toward the Whitehead farm, while Turner took the main force to continue their bloody circuit. By sunrise, they planned to have neutralized every white family within a 10-mile radius, creating a buffer zone before marching on Jerusalem. The night air carried sounds that Southampton County had never heard before: the thunder of hoofbeats on dirt roads, the crash of doors being kicked in, the screams of families who had never imagined their enslaved workforce might turn against them. Dogs barked frantically across the countryside, sensing violence their masters couldn't yet comprehend. At the Whitehead farm, Turner's bloodiest work awaited, where a family's attempt to hide would only delay the inevitable reckoning. Margaret Whitehead's bare feet slapped against dew-soaked grass as she fled through her family's orchard, her white nightgown ghostly in the pre-dawn darkness. Behind her, the screams from the farmhouse had already fallen silent, replaced by the methodical sounds of men searching for survivors. The sweet scent of ripening peaches mixed with smoke from the kitchen fire her family would never tend again. This single chase would become the rebellion's most documented horror, searing Turner's name into American memory as the preacher who showed no mercy to innocents. Turner had divided his forces, but the Whitehead farm required his personal attention. Richard Whitehead owned one of the county's largest arsenals, and his family represented everything Turner believed God had called him to destroy. The farmhouse sat on a hill overlooking tobacco fields, its windows glowing with lamplight as the family prepared for what they assumed would be another ordinary day. The attack began at 4:30 a.m. with overwhelming force. Hark Travis and Will Francis burst through the front door while Turner's main group surrounded the house to prevent escape. Richard Whitehead reached for his rifle, but took a hatchet blow to his shoulder before he could aim. His wife Catherine tried to shield their children, but was cut down in the hallway, her blood spattering the family portraits that had watched over 3 generations of Whitehead prosperity. But 18-year-old Margaret had escaped through a back window, running barefoot through the orchard where she'd picked fruit as a child. Turner pursued her personally, his hatchet gleaming in the moonlight as he tracked her through the trees. She stumbled over exposed roots, her nightgown catching on low branches, terror driving her deeper into the darkness she'd never navigated alone. From Turner's recorded confession, "I pursued her with my sword, but could not catch her. I then got a club and knocked her down. But she, getting up, ran on, and I pursued her and overtook her and killed her with my sword." The chase lasted nearly 15 minutes, Margaret's desperate flight taking her through familiar terrain that offered no sanctuary. Turner's methodical pursuit demonstrated the cold calculation behind his religious fervor. This wasn't passionate violence, but systematic execution, each death serving his larger vision of divine justice. Margaret's murder would dominate newspaper coverage and courtroom proceedings, her youth and gender making her the perfect symbol of Southern vulnerability. But what the historical record often omits is the presence of other Whitehead enslaved people who watched the pursuit without intervention. They had their own calculations to make: help the girl who'd grown up alongside them, or remain neutral in a rebellion that might secure their freedom. By dawn, Turner's band had killed 10 members of the Whitehead family, making it the rebellion's bloodiest single location. They seized 12 muskets, multiple pistols, and enough ammunition to supply a small army. More crucially, they recruited 8 more followers, bringing their total to 23 armed and mounted rebels. The Whitehead farm became Turner's temporary headquarters as his followers organized weapons and planned their next moves. Turner himself spent these precious minutes praying, seeking divine confirmation that the carnage was proceeding according to heaven's plan. His followers watched him with growing unease, perhaps beginning to understand the difference between religious vision and brutal reality. But Turner's tactical genius lay in understanding momentum. Each successful attack increased his band's confidence while spreading terror through the white community. By 7 a.m., smoke columns rose from multiple locations across Southampton County as news of the rebellion spread through networks, both enslaved and free. The rebellion's success created an unexpected problem. Too many recruits. Field hands abandoned their posts to join what appeared to be a successful uprising. But many brought only agricultural tools rather than weapons. Turner's disciplined core group found itself leading a growing mob whose enthusiasm outpaced their training or equipment. At the Bryant farm, Turner's expanding army encountered their first armed resistance. Levi Bryant had heard distant gunfire and barricaded his family inside their stone root cellar. When Turner's men approached, Bryant fired through a window, wounding one rebel and forcing the others to take cover. The brief firefight revealed a troubling reality. White resistance was organizing faster than Turner had anticipated. Turner made a crucial decision at the Bryant farm. Rather than waste time and men on a fortified position, he bypassed the property and continued toward Jerusalem. This choice would prove fateful, leaving armed and angry survivors in his rear, while precious daylight hours slipped away. The sun climbed higher over Southampton County, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full scope of Turner's rebellion. Smoke signals from burning outbuildings created a primitive communication network, alerting distant farms to prepare for attack or flee entirely. But Turner's greatest challenge wasn't white resistance. It was maintaining control over his growing army as religious mission transformed into something far more chaotic and unpredictable. The march toward Jerusalem would test whether divine calling could survive the harsh mathematics of organized warfare. Dust clouds rose like Judgment Day prophecies as Turner's mounted army swelled to nearly 60 followers, their voices joining in Baptist hymns that echoed across tobacco fields, now abandoned by fleeing overseers. The sound of horses' hooves mixed with the creak of leather and the metallic rattle of seized weapons, while the morning sun beat down on a landscape transformed by revolution. But with each new recruit, Turner's disciplined mission fractured into something harder to control. This was the moment when organized rebellion began its dangerous slide toward uncontrolled uprising, testing whether religious authority could govern the chaos of war. Turner rode at the front of his growing procession, his preacher's composure masking growing concerns about the mob behind him. What had begun as a carefully planned strike with 6 trusted men had become a sprawling army that included field hands, house servants, and even some free blacks who saw opportunity in the chaos. Many carried only farm implements, scythes, hammers, hoes, weapons, better suited to harvest than battle. The Parker farm fell to Turner's army at 9:15 a.m., but the attack revealed troubling changes in the rebellion's character. Where Turner's original band had killed efficiently and moved quickly, the larger group lingered to loot, settling personal scores with cruel overseers and destroying property that served no tactical purpose. Turner watched his followers burn barns filled with tobacco, valuable resources that could have funded their cause. From a letter by Colonel Francis Epps, September 1st, 1831. The insurgents appeared to have no unified command structure beyond Turner himself, with various factions pursuing separate agendas under the umbrella of rebellion. Turner's strategy required reaching Jerusalem before white authorities could organize effective resistance. The county seat held the arsenal, jail, and courthouse symbols of white power that, once captured, would legitimize his revolution and potentially trigger sympathetic uprisings across Virginia. But his expanded army moved with the sluggish pace of an undisciplined mob rather than the swift strike force he'd envisioned. At the Porter farm, Turner encountered a scene that would haunt him. His followers had not only killed the white family, but were torturing survivors before finishing them. This violated Turner's understanding of divine justice, which demanded swift execution rather than sadistic cruelty. When he intervened to stop the torture, some followers questioned his authority for the first time. The rebellion was consuming itself from within, religious mission contaminated by human vengeance and the intoxicating taste of temporarily reversed power dynamics. Turner realized he was leading not just a revolution, but a social explosion that had been building pressure for generations. Word of the uprising had reached neighboring counties by mid-morning. Church bells rang alarm signals across eastern Virginia, while riders carried news toward Richmond and Norfolk. The state's militia system, designed for exactly this scenario, began its ponderous activation. Turner's window of opportunity was closing faster than morning shadows, but the white community's response revealed its own fractures. Wealthy plantation owners fled toward cities with their families and portable wealth, abandoning smaller farmers who lacked resources to escape. Some overseers simply vanished, leaving enslaved people to make individual choices about joining Turner or remaining neutral. At the Harris farm, Turner's army encountered an unexpected sight. The white family seated calmly on their front porch, surrounded by their enslaved workforce who had formed a protective circle. The family's treatment of their workers had been notably humane, and when offered the chance to join Turner's rebellion, the enslaved people had instead chosen to protect their masters. This presented Turner with a theological crisis. His divine mission called for killing all whites, but these particular whites had the protection of the very people he claimed to be liberating. After tense negotiation, Turner's army bypassed the Harris farm, but the incident planted seeds of doubt among his followers about the universality of their cause. Never fight a war with saints and sinners. Turner's army reached the Blunt farm at 11 a.m., where they encountered their first significant white resistance. Isaiah Blunt had gathered his neighbors into a makeshift fortress with rifles positioned to cover all approaches. When Turner's advance scouts appeared, disciplined volleys drove them back with casualties. The rebellion had met organized opposition for the first time. The firefight at the Blunt farm lasted 40 minutes, precious time Turner couldn't afford to lose. His followers, mostly agricultural workers with no military training, struggled against opponents who knew how to use cover and coordinate their fire. 3 rebels died in the assault, while several others suffered wounds that would slow the army's advance. Turner made another tactical decision that would prove crucial. Rather than continue the costly assault, he ordered his army to divide. One group would continue toward Jerusalem along the main road, while he took a smaller force on a flanking maneuver through the woods. This division would either allow him to attack Jerusalem from multiple directions or fatally weaken his forces if they encountered separate resistance. But Turner didn't realize that white militias were already forming ahead of him, drawn by the smoke columns and fleeing survivors who had spread news of the rebellion throughout Southampton County. His divine mission was about to collide with the harsh realities of organized military resistance. The race for Jerusalem had become a test of whether prophecy could outrun preparation, and Turner's window for success was closing faster than he knew. Musket smoke drifted across the Jerusalem road like incense from a burning altar, while Turner's divided army approached the county seat through tobacco fields that provided scant cover from increasingly organized resistance. The town's church bells had been ringing since dawn, their bronze voices carrying warnings across miles of farmland where white families barricaded themselves behind whatever defenses they could improvise. Turner's divine mission had become a desperate race against time, with the prize being Virginia's most valuable arsenal and the symbol of white governmental power. This was the moment when Turner's rebellion would either triumph spectacularly or shatter against the machinery of state violence that was rapidly organizing to crush it. Turner's main force, now reduced to 42 men after the division at Blunt Farm, moved through cornfields toward Jerusalem's outskirts. The town sat on slightly elevated ground, its courthouse dome visible above the tree line like a white beacon of the authority Turner intended to destroy. Church spires punctuated the skyline, their crosses catching morning sunlight that seemed to mock his prophetic certainty. But Jerusalem wasn't the undefended prize Turner had expected. Militia companies from 3 counties had converged on the town throughout the morning, turning it into an armed camp. Captain Alexander Pete's Southampton militia had been joined by units from Norfolk and Portsmouth, creating a defensive force of nearly 200 trained soldiers with artillery support. From the Richmond Enquirer, August 30th, 1831, the town presented the appearance of a military encampment, with armed patrols visible at every intersection and citizens volunteering to man barricades constructed from overturned wagons and furniture. Turner's scouts brought disturbing intelligence. Jerusalem's approaches were covered by coordinated fields of fire, with militia positioned in buildings that commanded every route into town. The arsenal that had been his primary objective was now heavily guarded, its weapons likely already distributed to defenders who knew how to use them effectively. The rebellion faced its first strategic crisis. Turner's original plan had depended on surprise and speed, striking before white authorities could respond. But news of the uprising had traveled faster than his army, allowing defenders to prepare while his forces were depleted by casualties and desertion. Nearly 20 followers had abandoned the cause after witnessing the firefight at Blunt Farm, preferring to risk individual punishment rather than certain death in a frontal assault. Turner gathered his remaining lieutenants, Hark Travis, Will Francis, and Sam Edwards, in a tobacco barn 2 miles from Jerusalem. The men who had followed him through a night of killing now looked to their prophet for guidance that seemed increasingly disconnected from tactical reality. Travis, the most experienced fighter among them, argued for immediate withdrawal to the dismal swamp, where they could wage guerrilla warfare indefinitely. But Turner's divine visions offered no contingency plans for military failure. His prophecies had shown him triumphant entry into Jerusalem, not the bloody siege warfare that now seemed inevitable. For the first time since the rebellion began, doubt crept into his voice, as he insisted that heaven would provide victory against overwhelming odds. The delay proved fatal. While Turner's Council of War debated options, militia forces were positioning themselves to cut off all retreat routes. Captain Pete had deployed his men with the methodical precision of someone who understood that this rebellion suppression would determine the fate of slavery throughout the South. At 2:30 p.m., Turner made his final strategic decision. Rather than retreat or attempt a desperate assault, he would probe Jerusalem's defenses with a small force while keeping his main army in reserve. This compromise satisfied neither aggressive nor cautious factions among his followers, further fragmenting the unity that had sustained them through their night of terror. The probe force of 12 men approached Jerusalem from the east, moving through a cemetery where white headstones provided scattered cover. They encountered the first militia pickets at 300 yards, triggering a firefight that echoed across the county seat like thunder from a clear sky. The rebels' agricultural weapons proved no match for military muskets fired from prepared positions. Within minutes, half the probe force lay dead or wounded among the gravestones, their blood seeping into soil that held generations of white Southampton families. The survivors fled back to Turner's position, with news that confirmed his worst fears. Jerusalem was impregnable to direct assault, and militia reinforcements were arriving hourly. God's army was dissolving before his eyes. Turner's remaining followers began slipping away as afternoon shadows lengthened, understanding that their prophet's divine protection had failed against earthly firepower. Some attempted to return to their plantations, hoping to escape punishment by claiming coercion. Others fled toward the dismal swamp, choosing the slim chance of survival in the wilderness over certain death in a hopeless battle. By evening, Turner's rebellion had collapsed from within, leaving him with fewer than 20 followers and no viable path to victory. The divine mission that had begun with such terrible certainty now faced the mathematical reality of organized resistance. The prophet's apocalypse was ending not with divine triumph, but with the slow dissolve of faith under military pressure. Turner would soon learn whether his God had more trials in store for his chosen instrument. Turner's face showed no emotion as his final followers scattered like leaves in a storm. Wind, abandoning their prophet to face alone the consequences of revolution that had failed before it truly began. The woods around Jerusalem echoed with the baying of bloodhounds and the shouts of militia patrols, while Turner himself became the most hunted man in Virginia's history. The rebellion that had terrorized the South for 36 hours was dissolving into individual flights toward uncertain sanctuary. This was the moment when divine mission became desperate survival, and Turner would discover whether his God protected failed prophets or abandoned them to earthly justice. By nightfall on August 22nd, Turner's army of 60 had reduced to 7 loyal followers who still believed their prophet might yet deliver them from the tightening net of white vengeance. They retreated deeper into the woods between Jerusalem and the Dismal Swamp, following deer paths through underbrush that tore at their clothes and skin. Behind them, the sounds of organized pursuit grew steadily louder. Major General Richard Epes had assumed command of the militia response, coordinating units from 4 counties in the largest manhunt Virginia had ever mounted. His strategy was methodical: establish checkpoints on all roads leading out of Southampton County, then sweep the interior with overlapping patrols until every rebel was captured or killed. Epes understood that allowing any significant number of rebels to escape would encourage similar uprisings across the South. From General Epes's official report, September 10, 1831. The suppression of this insurrection required not merely the capture of its leaders, but the demonstration that armed rebellion by the enslaved population would be met with overwhelming and decisive force. Turner's remaining band took shelter in a cave system near Raccoon Swamp, where limestone formations provided temporary concealment from the patrols that crisscrossed Southampton County. But their sanctuary was also a trap: only one narrow entrance, no water source, and limited food supplies that would force them back into the open within days. The manhunt revealed the true scale of white fear generated by Turner's rebellion. Militia patrols shot suspected rebels on sight, often without bothering to determine whether their targets had actually participated in the uprising. Free blacks found themselves particularly vulnerable, their legal status providing no protection from panicked soldiers who viewed all dark-skinned faces as potential threats. In Norfolk, Richmond, and Petersburg, white families barricaded their homes and demanded military protection from slave populations that had shown no signs of rebellion. The psychological impact of Turner's uprising extended far beyond Southampton County, touching every community where enslaved people outnumbered their masters. But Turner's greatest challenge wasn't evading capture, it was reconciling his divine mission with its catastrophic failure. In the cave's darkness, he continued to pray for guidance, while his remaining followers questioned whether God had truly called them to this doomed enterprise. Will Francis, wounded in the Jerusalem probe, died during their second night in hiding, his infection a grim reminder of their mortal vulnerability. Turner made the decision that would define his final weeks. Rather than flee toward distant safety, he would remain in Southampton County, hiding in familiar territory while continuing to seek divine revelation about his failed prophecy. This choice condemned him to eventual capture, but preserved his image as a prophet who refused to abandon his calling even in defeat. His followers made different calculations. Hark Travis attempted to reach the Dismal Swamp, but was captured by militia patrols within 24 hours. Sam Edwards surrendered voluntarily, hoping confession might earn him transportation rather than execution. By August 25th, Turner was alone in the woods that had witnessed his religious awakening, hunted by every white man in Virginia. The cave became Turner's hermitage, where he wrestled with the theological implications of failure. Had God tested his faith and found it wanting? Was the rebellion itself a divine trial designed to refine his understanding? Or had human weakness corrupted heaven's perfect plan? Turner's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. With no reliable food source and constant stress from evading patrols, he grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. But his mental state remained focused on spiritual rather than practical concerns, suggesting either remarkable faith or dangerous delusion. Blood calls for blood. Heaven demands. The manhunt's intensity increased as white authorities realized Turner remained at large. Governor John Floyd dispatched additional militia units to Southampton County, while federal troops were positioned to prevent the rebellion from spreading to neighboring states. The reward for Turner's capture reached unprecedented levels, making every free black and poor white a potential bounty hunter. Turner's final hiding place was discovered through betrayal rather than detection. A free black named Benjamin Phipps, hoping to collect the reward money, provided information about Turner's location to local authorities. The cave system where Turner had spent his final days of freedom was surrounded by armed men who called for his surrender. On October 30th, 1831, 68 days after his rebellion began, Nat Turner emerged from hiding with his hands raised, ending the most significant slave uprising in American history. But his capture was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape the South's relationship with its enslaved population and Turner's place in the complex mythology of American resistance. The prophet's earthly trial was about to begin, but his legacy would prove far more durable than his revolution. Turner's voice carried the same evangelical cadence that had once inspired followers to kill as he dictated his confession to Thomas Ruffin Gray, the white lawyer who saw opportunity in recording the rebel prophet's final testimony. The Southampton County jail cell reeked of unwashed bodies and human waste, while outside, crowds gathered daily hoping to glimpse the man who had terrorized Virginia's slaveholding class. Gray's questions probed for signs of insanity or outside influence, but Turner's responses revealed a mind that remained convinced of divine calling even in chains. This confession would become the definitive account of America's bloodiest slave rebellion, though filtered through the lens of a white attorney who had his own reasons for shaping Turner's narrative. Turner sat shackled in the jail's corner cell, his physical deterioration evident in sunken cheeks and hollow eyes that still burned with religious intensity. 68 days of hiding in woods and swamps had reduced him to a scarecrow figure, but his voice retained the power that had once moved congregations to tears and followers to murder. Gray positioned himself carefully, recording every word while watching for signs that Turner might attack even in chains. The confession sessions lasted 5 days, with Gray returning each morning to probe deeper into Turner's motivations and methods. What emerged was a detailed account of not just the rebellion's events, but the psychological and spiritual journey that had transformed a literate slave into Virginia's most feared revolutionary. Turner spoke of his visions with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to describe killing techniques. From Turner's confession as recorded by Thomas Gray, November 1st, 1831, "I was not addicted to stealing in my youth, nor have ever been. Yet such was the confidence of the Negroes in the neighborhood, even at this early period of my life, in my superior judgment, that they would often carry me with them when they were going on any roguery to plan for them." Gray's motivations for recording the confession were complex. As a slaveholder himself, he sought to understand how the rebellion had occurred and whether it represented a broader threat to the institution of slavery. But he also recognized the commercial potential of Turner's story, publishing the confession as a pamphlet that would sell thousands of copies throughout the North and South. Turner's account revealed the careful planning behind what many whites had dismissed as spontaneous savagery. He described months of preparation, the recruitment of specific followers based on their skills and commitment, and the strategic thinking behind target selection. This wasn't the work of a deranged fanatic, but a methodical revolutionary who had studied his enemy's vulnerabilities. The confession process became a psychological duel between Turner and Gray. The lawyer probed for evidence of mental illness or external manipulation that might explain away the rebellion's indigenous origins. Turner insisted on the divine nature of his calling, while providing rational explanations for tactical decisions, creating a portrait that was both mystical and pragmatic. News of Turner's capture had spread across the nation, making his trial one of the most closely watched legal proceedings of the antebellum period. Journalists from northern and southern newspapers descended on Southampton County, while local officials struggled to maintain order among crowds that included curiosity seekers, relatives of victims, and enslaved people brought by their masters to witness Turner's fate. The trial began on November 5, 1831, in the same courthouse Turner had planned to capture during his march on Jerusalem. The irony wasn't lost on observers who noted how the building's white columns and imposing architecture symbolized the governmental authority Turner had sought to overthrow. Judge Jeremiah Cobb presided over proceedings that were carefully choreographed to demonstrate white legal system's supremacy. Turner's court-appointed attorney, William Parker, faced an impossible task. Virginia law provided death sentences for enslaved people who killed whites, with no meaningful provisions for self-defense or mitigation. Parker's only viable strategy was to argue insanity, but Turner's coherent confession had undermined that approach before the trial began. Turner himself showed no interest in mounting a defense. When asked how he pleaded to charges of conspiracy and murder, he responded simply, "Not guilty, because I do not feel guilty." This statement encapsulated his continued belief that divine commandment justified his actions, regardless of human law's condemnation. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Turner's leadership role in the rebellion, calling survivors who identified him as the primary instigator and coordinator. But the trial's outcome was never in doubt. Virginia's legal system existed to protect white property interests, and Turner represented the ultimate threat to that order. Witness testimony revealed the extent of white trauma caused by the rebellion. Margaret Whitehead's mother, Catherine Whitehead's sister, and numerous other relatives of victims provided emotional accounts of the murders, while demanding exemplary punishment for Turner and his followers. But the trial also exposed uncomfortable truths about slavery that white authorities would have preferred to keep hidden. Turner's literacy, his knowledge of current events, and his sophisticated understanding of revolutionary strategy challenged assumptions about enslaved people's intellectual capabilities. The verdict took the jury just 2 hours to reach, guilty on all counts, with a sentence of death by hanging. Turner received the news with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the proceedings, suggesting either profound faith in his divine mission or complete acceptance of his earthly fate. His final statement to the court would echo through American history, raising questions about justice, resistance, and the moral complexities of slavery that the nation would struggle to resolve for another 3 decades. The hangman's rope creaked in the November wind as Turner stood on the gallows scaffold, his final words carrying across a crowd that included masters who had brought their enslaved workers to witness what happened to rebels who defied the natural order. The smell of wood smoke from morning cooking fires, mixed with the tension sweat of hundreds of spectators who had traveled miles to see the preacher-killer meet his end. Turner's execution would close the rebellion's bloody chapter, but his legacy would haunt the South long after his body stopped swinging. This was the moment when Turner's earthly mission transformed into something far more dangerous to slaveholders: martyrdom that could inspire future generations of resistance. November 11th, 1831, dawned clear and cold over Southampton County, with frost covering the courthouse square where Turner's gallows had been erected. Authorities had chosen a public execution to demonstrate the consequences of slave rebellion, but they couldn't control the symbolism that would emerge from their carefully orchestrated spectacle. Turner walked to the scaffold with the same composed dignity he had maintained throughout his trial, refusing the ministrations of white clergymen who offered to pray for his soul's salvation. When asked if he had any final words, he looked out over the crowd that included many of the enslaved people he had hoped to liberate and spoke with the voice of a prophet who remained convinced of his divine calling. "I am ready to die," Turner said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "The time will come when you will know that what I did was right." These words, recorded by multiple witnesses, would be quoted in slave quarters and abolitionist newspapers for decades to come, transforming Turner from failed revolutionary into enduring symbol of resistance. The execution itself was mercifully swift, but the aftermath revealed the depth of white fear that Turner's rebellion had generated. His body was flayed and beheaded, with pieces distributed as souvenirs to spectators who wanted tangible proof that the most dangerous slave rebel in American history was truly dead. This grotesque desecration served white psychological needs, but also created relics that would take on their own symbolic power. Turner's head was reportedly kept by Dr. Massenburg, who also removed his skin to make purses and other items for local white families. These macabre trophies reflected not triumph, but terror, the need to destroy Turner so completely that no trace of his physical presence could inspire future uprisings. But Turner's real legacy lay not in his mortal remains, but in the psychological earthquake his rebellion had triggered throughout the South. Virginia's legislature immediately passed new laws restricting enslaved people's movement, education, and religious gatherings. The teaching of reading and writing to slaves was criminalized, while free blacks faced new restrictions on their legal rights and economic activities. Similar laws spread across slave states like wildfire, creating the harsh legal framework that would characterize Southern slavery's final decades. Turner's rebellion had demonstrated enslaved people's capacity for organized resistance, forcing white authorities to acknowledge threats they had previously dismissed as impossible. From the Virginia General Assembly proceedings, January 15, 1832, the recent insurrection has demonstrated the necessity of more stringent regulations governing the slave population, particularly regarding their education and religious instruction. The rebellion's aftermath also revealed deep divisions within white Southern society about slavery's future. Some legislators, shaken by Turner's uprising, proposed gradual emancipation plans that might prevent future rebellions. But these moderate voices were overwhelmed by reactionary forces that demanded even harsher controls on the enslaved population. Turner's impact extended far beyond Virginia's borders. Northern abolitionists seized on his rebellion as evidence of slavery's inherent violence and instability, while Southern defenders of the institution used it to justify increasingly repressive measures. The national conversation about slavery had been permanently altered by 36 hours of violence in rural Southampton County. The manhunt for Turner's surviving followers continued for months after his execution, with authorities determined to capture or kill every rebel who had participated in the uprising. 19 conspirators were eventually executed, while dozens more were transported to distant territories or sold out of state. The enslaved community paid a collective price for Turner's individual act of resistance. Churches throughout the South implemented new restrictions on black preaching, recognizing the dangerous potential of religious authority in enslaved hands. Turner's combination of literacy, charisma, and divine calling had created a template for revolutionary leadership that white authorities were determined to prevent from emerging again. Yet Turner's influence proved impossible to contain. His name became a whispered legend in slave quarters throughout the South, spoken with mixtures of fear and admiration that reflected the complex emotions his rebellion had stirred. Some viewed him as a prophet who had sacrificed himself for freedom. Others saw him as a dangerous fanatic whose actions had made their own lives more difficult. The rebellion's memory was carefully managed by white authorities who sought to control its narrative. Official accounts emphasized Turner's mental instability and the rebellion's swift suppression, while downplaying the organizational sophistication that had made it possible. But alternative versions circulated through oral tradition, preserving aspects of Turner's story that written records attempted to erase. 20 years after Turner's execution, his rebellion would be remembered as both warning and inspiration as the nation moved toward civil war. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 drew explicit comparisons to Turner's uprising, while Confederate fears of slave insurrection during the Civil War reflected lasting trauma from Southampton County's 36 hours of terror. Even today, local legends claim that Turner's ghost still walks the woods of Southampton County on August nights, carrying his bloodied hatchet and preaching revolution to those who dare to listen. Section 8. Final words and lasting terror. The hangman's rope creaked in the November wind as Turner stood on the gallows scaffold, his final words carrying across a crowd that included masters who had brought their enslaved workers to witness what happened to rebels who defied the natural order. The smell of wood smoke from morning cooking fires, mixed with the tension sweat of hundreds of spectators who had traveled miles to see the preacher killer meet his end. Turner's execution would close the rebellion's bloody chapter, but his legacy would haunt the South long after his body stopped swinging. This was the moment when Turner's earthly mission transformed into something far more dangerous to slaveholders: martyrdom that could inspire future generations of resistance. November 11th, 1831, dawned clear and cold over Southampton County, with frost covering the courthouse square where Turner's gallows had been erected. Authorities had chosen a public execution to demonstrate the consequences of slave rebellion, but they couldn't control the symbolism that would emerge from their carefully orchestrated spectacle. Turner walked to the scaffold with the same composed dignity he had maintained throughout his trial, refusing the ministrations of white clergymen who offered to pray for his soul's salvation. When asked if he had any final words, he looked out over the crowd that included many of the enslaved people he had hoped to liberate and spoke with the voice of a prophet who remained convinced of his divine calling. "I am ready to die," Turner said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "The time will come when you will know that what I did was right." These words, recorded by multiple witnesses, would be quoted in slave quarters and abolitionist newspapers for decades to come, transforming Turner from failed revolutionary into enduring symbol of resistance. The execution itself was mercifully swift, but the aftermath revealed the depth of white fear that Turner's rebellion had generated. His body was flayed and beheaded, with pieces distributed as souvenirs to spectators who wanted tangible proof that the most dangerous slave rebel in American history was truly dead. This grotesque desecration served white psychological needs, but also created relics that would take on their own symbolic power. Turner's head was reportedly kept by Dr. Massenberg, who also removed his skin to make purses and other items for local white families. These macabre trophies reflected not triumph, but terror, the need to destroy Turner so completely that no trace of his physical presence could inspire future uprisings. But Turner's real legacy lay not in his mortal remains, but in the psychological earthquake his rebellion had triggered throughout the South. Virginia's legislature immediately passed new laws restricting enslaved people's movement, education, and religious gatherings. The teaching of reading and writing to slaves was criminalized, while free blacks faced new restrictions on their legal rights and economic activities. Similar laws spread across slave states like wildfire, creating the harsh legal framework that would characterize Southern slavery's final decades. Turner's rebellion had demonstrated enslaved people's capacity for organized resistance, forcing white authorities to acknowledge threats they had previously dismissed as impossible. From the Virginia General Assembly proceedings, January 15, 1832, the recent insurrection has demonstrated the necessity of more stringent regulations governing the slave population, particularly regarding their education and religious instruction. The rebellion's aftermath also revealed deep divisions within white Southern society about slavery's future. Some legislators, shaken by Turner's uprising, proposed gradual emancipation plans that might prevent future rebellions. But these moderate voices were overwhelmed by reactionary forces that demanded even harsher controls on the enslaved population. Turner's impact extended far beyond Virginia's borders. Northern abolitionists seized on his rebellion as evidence of slavery's inherent violence and instability, while Southern defenders of the institution used it to justify increasingly repressive measures. The national conversation about slavery had been permanently altered by 36 hours of violence in rural Southampton County. The manhunt for Turner's surviving followers continued for months after his execution, with authorities determined to capture or kill every rebel who had participated in the uprising. 19 conspirators were eventually executed, while dozens more were transported to distant territories or sold out of state. The enslaved community paid a collective price for Turner's individual act of resistance. Churches throughout the South implemented new restrictions on black preaching, recognizing the dangerous potential of religious authority in enslaved hands. Turner's combination of literacy, charisma, and divine calling had created a template for revolutionary leadership that white authorities were determined to prevent from emerging again. Yet Turner's influence proved impossible to contain. His name became a whispered legend in slave quarters throughout the South, spoken with mixtures of fear and admiration that reflected the complex emotions his rebellion had stirred. Some viewed him as a prophet who had sacrificed himself for freedom. Others saw him as a dangerous fanatic whose actions had made their own lives more difficult. The rebellion's memory was carefully managed by white authorities who sought to control its narrative. Official accounts emphasized Turner's mental instability and the rebellion's swift suppression, while downplaying the organizational sophistication that had made it possible. But alternative versions circulated through oral tradition, preserving aspects of Turner's story that written records attempted to erase. 20 years after Turner's execution, his rebellion would be remembered as both warning and inspiration as the nation moved toward civil war. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 drew explicit comparisons to Turner's uprising, while Confederate fears of slave insurrection during the Civil War reflected lasting trauma from Southampton County's 36 hours of terror. Even today, local legends claim that Turner's ghost still walks the woods of Southampton County on August nights, carrying his bloodied hatchet and preaching revolution to those who dare to listen. Section 9. The Prophet's Enduring Shadow. Turner's rebellion cast a shadow that stretched far beyond the gallows tree, reshaping American slavery and planting seeds of fear that would grow into the Civil War's bloody harvest 3 decades later. The legal restrictions imposed after Southampton County became the blueprint for controlling enslaved populations throughout the South, while Turner's name evolved into a symbol that meant different things to different people. Terrorist to some, freedom fighter to others, prophet to those who believed his visions transcended earthly failure. His 36 hours of violence had accomplished what decades of peaceful resistance could not, forcing America to confront the inherent brutality of its peculiar institution. This was how one man's divine calling became a nation's reckoning, proving that some truths can only be written in blood. The immediate aftermath of Turner's execution saw Southern states racing to implement what historians would later call the Black Codes, comprehensive legal frameworks designed to prevent any repetition of Southampton County's nightmare. South Carolina banned enslaved people from learning to read or write, while Georgia prohibited black preaching without white supervision. Mississippi required written passes for all movement between plantations, and North Carolina made it illegal for free blacks to carry firearms. These laws revealed the depth of white terror that Turner had inspired. The rebellion had lasted only 36 hours and involved fewer than 70 active participants, yet it triggered legislative responses that affected millions of enslaved people across the South. The message was clear. Turner's vision of divine justice had been so terrifying that it required complete reconstruction of the social order to prevent its return. But Turner's influence extended far beyond Southern legislatures. His confession, published by Thomas Gray and reprinted countless times, became one of the most widely read documents of the antebellum period. Northern abolitionists seized on Turner's religious language and methodical planning as evidence that enslaved people possessed both the moral authority and intellectual capacity to overthrow their oppression. William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, had begun publication just months before Turner's rebellion, and the uprising provided Garrison with powerful ammunition for his arguments against gradual emancipation. If enslaved people were capable of organized revolution, Garrison argued, then immediate abolition was not just morally necessary, but practically urgent. From The Liberator, September 3, 1831, the Southampton insurrection demonstrates that slavery contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction, and that every day of delay in ending this institution brings us closer to a general conflagration that will consume the South. Turner's theological legacy proved equally complex. His combination of Christian prophecy and violent resistance challenged both pro-slavery and anti-slavery religious communities. Southern preachers struggled to explain how biblical literacy, which they had promoted among enslaved people as a tool of control, had produced such devastating rebellion. Many concluded that selective religious education was more dangerous than complete ignorance. Northern religious communities faced their own theological crisis. Turner's rebellion forced them to confront whether Christianity sanctioned violent resistance to oppression. Some, like Garrison, embraced Turner as a Moses figure, leading his people toward freedom. Others worried that celebrating Turner's violence might undermine Christianity's message of peace and forgiveness. The rebellion's impact on enslaved communities was profound and contradictory. Turner had demonstrated that organized resistance was possible, but the brutal suppression that followed showed its terrible costs. Many enslaved people retreated into more cautious forms of resistance, work slowdowns, sabotage, escape, rather than risk the community-wide punishment that open rebellion brought. Yet Turner's example also inspired individual acts of defiance. Throughout the 1830s and 40s, isolated incidents of enslaved people killing their masters were attributed to Turner's influence, whether or not any direct connection existed. The preacher-prophet had become a symbol of resistance that transcended his physical presence. Turner's shadow fell heavily across the Civil War when it finally came. Confederate leaders' obsessive fear of slave insurrection during the conflict reflected lessons learned from Southampton County. Military resources that might have fought Union armies were instead deployed to patrol slave quarters and prevent uprisings that existed more in white imagination than reality. Union forces deliberately cultivated Turner's memory as psychological warfare against the Confederacy. Black Union troops carried images of Turner into battle, while Union generals encouraged enslaved people to view the war as fulfillment of Turner's prophecy. The rebellion that had failed in 1831 became a rallying cry for the war that would finally end slavery in 1865. But Turner's most lasting legacy lay in the questions his rebellion raised about the nature of freedom, justice, and resistance in America. His willingness to kill innocent people in pursuit of liberation forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about the violence embedded in slavery itself. If enslaved people had no legal recourse against oppression, Turner seemed to ask, what moral alternatives existed to armed resistance? These questions would echo through American history long after Turner's death. The civil rights movement of the 1960s grappled with similar tensions between nonviolent resistance and armed self-defense. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. explicitly rejected Turner's violent methods while acknowledging the desperation that had driven them. Even today, Turner's legacy remains contentious. Virginia's historical markers describing the rebellion use careful language that neither celebrates nor condemns his actions, reflecting ongoing disagreement about how America should remember its history of racial violence. Some view Turner as a freedom fighter whose methods were justified by the brutality of slavery. Others see him as a terrorist whose violence was inexcusable regardless of his motivations. The woods of Southampton County still whisper Turner's story to those who know how to listen. Local historians point out locations where the rebellion unfolded: the Travis Farm, where it began; the Whitehead property, where Margaret died; The roads Turner's army traveled toward their failed assault on Jerusalem. These sites have become unofficial memorials to a complex legacy that refuses simple interpretation. Turner's prophecy ultimately proved more durable than his rebellion. His vision of divine justice, achieved through violent resistance, would echo through American history in ways he could never have imagined. The civil war he had tried to start with 60 followers would eventually come with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, fulfilling his prediction that blood would flow until slavery ended. The preacher who had claimed God spoke through him had indeed delivered a message that America could not ignore, that slavery contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction, and that the nation would face divine judgment for its sins. Turner's 36 hours of terror had planted fears that would grow into the very conflict that would finally answer his prayers for freedom. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.